amidst everything else, the U.S. government is shut down. So there's a U.S. government shutdown going on. It's been going on for about 2 days. And essentially a government shutdown means that some things that are considered essential services continue. Say Social Security checks keep going out. Some things are conditional. You don't know. The government can kind of decide whether or not they want to keep them going. But the vast majority of government services shut down. Many government workers are put on furlough. And in fact, as Trump brought up here today, something that he called a hoax, by the way, during the campaign, Project 2025, one of the main authors, Russ Vought, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, is meeting with Trump to talk about how they can try to permanently lay off hundreds of thousands of federal workers, at least potentially during this shutdown. So very serious, very significant situation here that is going on with the U.S. government. And the question is, why is the government shut down? I think the most important thing for everyone to realize is the government is shut down as this is part of the attempt by the Republicans to bulldoze any opposition whatsoever to their broader agenda, which is to make the rich richer, the poor poorer, and make it so difficult for the rest of us that we're essentially treading water, barely keeping our head above the tide line, as it were. So this is part and parcel of what we've been seeing since Trump came in with the one big beautiful bill. But the proximate issue here, like I said, they have a broad agenda. The proximate issue here is the healthcare portion of the agenda. There's some other things that I'll get to, but what the Democrats are placing their willingness to compromise on is what you see on the screen there, and that is the 15 million people who will lose healthcare under the Republican plan that was passed earlier this year in the partial passage of the budget, the so-called one big beautiful bill. 15 million people, a $1.1 trillion cut. So that means a lot of people will be kicked off because of Medicaid, which was a big conversation people can remember from the one big beautiful bill. But many people will lose health care because they will also lose access to the subsidies for the American Care Act, the ACA, the so-called Obamacare. So when you put it together, at least 15 million people. That's another thing that we don't even know what the full impact of this is going to be, because there's all these other realities. Like, for instance, one of the things that will probably go away are zero premium plans that exist under the ACA exchange marketplace. So people who then have to pay something that they didn't have to pay month to month for healthcare, will they be able to come up with the money, or will they just be off healthcare? So we say $1.1 trillion cut, 15 million people kicked off of their healthcare, but it could in fact be more than 15 million people who lose their healthcare. So this is a dire situation. And by the way, if you look on year increases in inflation, the cost of healthcare in the past month or last month went up 4.2% from September of 2024. So the cost of healthcare already rising. People are going to be losing Medicaid. People are going to be losing ACA subsidies. So again, $1.1 trillion cut to healthcare, and at least 15 million people who are going to be kicked off. The Republicans have decided they want to shut down the government rather than make a change and walk any of that back. So that's really an amazing thing when you think about it. And I think another sort of aspect of this that we have to remember is that the other parts of this are also bad. Like, we're talking a lot about healthcare, but there are also things that the Democrats have just said that they'll let slide. I mean, one aspect, of course, are the massive $1 trillion tax cuts that were given away that were also a part of the one big beautiful bill. And by the way, one of the biggest beneficiaries of these corporate wing of those tax cuts are the healthcare companies. And there's an extension of a tax break, quote unquote tax break, really just, robbing people essentially for these healthcare insurers, that a recent examination looked at this going back to 2017, and that from 2017 until very recently, roughly $34 billion was funneled into the pockets of the biggest healthcare companies through this tax break. So that was extended in the one big beautiful bill. So, not only are they potentially kicking 15 million people off of their healthcare by trying to push through this agenda, through this shutdown, but they're also trying to lock in tax breaks. So it'll mean those same health insurance companies that no longer have to insure you are able to make billions of more dollars in the coming years in terms of so-called tax breaks, as it were. So, you look at that, bad enough. Even further, there's a third part to what's going on with the shutdown. And that's why I say we have to understand this as a part of bulldozing opposition to their entire agenda. And that is what you hear when you see the letter CR or hear the term continuing resolution. That's what that means is what you saw in the one big beautiful bill, which was healthcare, the tax cuts. That was not all. with the budget. In fact, the Republicans have been trying to cut every single other program that actually helps working class people, but they couldn't figure out exactly how to do it by the deadline. So in addition to locking in, kicking 15 million people off of healthcare, in addition to locking in $1 trillion tax break for the richest people and the richest corporations, including healthcare corporations, they also want to make sure that the funding for all other programs in the government remains level, for the next few months until they can figure out how to cut it even more. But here's the thing about that. Sounds good, right? Oh, well, it's just the same amount of money. Well, as we all know from our everyday finances, the things that cost a certain amount last year don't cost the same amount next year. So by keeping the funding the same, it actually is a cut. Because what happens is the cost of providing the service goes up. So if you have the same amount of money, you can't provide the same amount of services. And then if you think that a lot of these services people are getting, are in a worse situation because of inflation in the economy, they actually have to serve a broader group of people, which means that something that was already stretched thin is stretched thinner. So keeping the funding the same is actually an effective cut. So again, the shutdown is about essentially this. The Republican platform, which is to make the rich richer, the poor poorer, and keep the rest of us barely keeping our head above water. They're trying to bulldoze any opposition and use the shutdown to lock that in. And when I say the situation for people in this country, to make the rich rich, the poor poor, and the rest of us treading water, essentially, the situation is extremely dire. And we just have to note that at the outset. I mean, you've got anywhere between 18% and 33% of the population living in poverty, depending on how you measure it with the Census Bureau Household Pulse survey. You have well over 100 million people, 50 some odd million people, I have the stat there on the screen, you can see it, that are having at least some trouble making ends meet week to week. By the way, 43 million are finding it very difficult to make ends meet week to week. So think about that, 18 to 33% of the country, essentially between a fifth and a third of the country living in poverty. You have, almost the entirety of the workforce, when you look at that number of people struggling to make it week to week or struggling to make it week to week. I mean, this is a dire circumstance. That is what this plan that the Republicans are pushing is about, is actually making those numbers worse. And part of the reason I wanted to quote those numbers and the fact that it's going to get worse is those numbers come from the Household Pulse survey of the Census Bureau. And guess what Trump did to that? Well, he ended the collection of those statistics. I wonder why. So when you look at what's happening, that's the reality. The shutdown is being pushed to make the rich richer, the poor poorer, and keep the rest of us barely keeping our head above water. Now, why are they pushing the shutdown so aggressively on Trump's end? Because you would think, hey, do I really want to be the person seen coming up before an election as someone whose main issue was kicking 15 million people off of healthcare, and I wasn't really willing to make a deal to keep at least some of them on healthcare? Like, why would I do that? Do I really want to be the person who's known as shutting down the government, and ruining people's lives from federal workers and shutting down services and all the other problems that causes, coming into an election? Do I want to be that person? It sounds bad. I don't want that. You'd think that the PR aspect of it. Well, the reality is the Republicans basically think the Democrats will fold. And they ultimately feel that they're going to be able to bulldoze the Democratic Party opposition, and then they'll be able to lock this in, and there's really nothing people will be able to do. And since they've crushed the Democrats, people won't turn to the Democrats in the election, because why vote for somebody who hasn't been able to offer any sort of opposition? Now, you might think, hey, that sounds like a pretty big risk. I mean, for the Democrats, feels like great issue, right? Like, they're going to fight hard. Well, why is it that Trump and Johnson and Thune may think the Democrats might just roll over on them? Well, we've got a few clips here from just before the shutdown started about the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, their leaders in Congress, talking about their opposition to a shutdown and how hard they were fighting. Let's roll that clip.
So we hope and expect that Republicans will do the right thing. And if they don't, we're going to make clear to the American why they are playing games as it relates to the swearing in of Rep-elect Grijalva.
Is there anything you can do to stop it, as in Congress?
Yes. First, we will fight it in the courts, along with, people who will file suits. But second, I would hope, Kristen, that some of our Republican colleagues, I know they're loyal to Trump and does whatever he wants, but This is so far stepping over the line that I'd hope some of them would join us in legislation to prevent it from happening. We have such a proposal. I'm part of it. Hakeem and I sent a letter in late July. We demanded, actually, to them. We demanded that they sit down with us because we needed to work this out in a bipartisan way. And let me
They sent a letter. That's tough. And I should clarify now that I remember that second Chuck Schumer clip is about what they would do about the National Guard. So essentially nothing, hoping that they will come to the table. And that first clip, of course, referring to the inability to the fact that they're not swearing in a Democrat who won a special election so they could do a number of different things, including address this issue with the Epstein files. So on all the critical important issues, the Democrats there are saying that the most they're going to do is hope for the best, introduce legislation that will fail, or send a letter, whether it's the shutdown, the National Guard, or Epstein. So no wonder the Trump administration is thinking, hey, why don't we just go for this? Because are these people really going to ride out the anger of people in this country about the shutdown of the government and all the ripple effects? Probably not. They'll probably just roll over, which will make it even easier for us to beat them in the midterms, because why vote for somebody who's shown you that all they're going to do is hope for the best and write a letter? And we can't forget, really, that the Democrats are part of the reason that we are here in the first place. Because when they had control of the White House in the start of Biden's administration, they had control of the Senate, they had control of the House. In the start of the Obama administration, they had control of the Senate, they had control of the House, they had control of the White House. And in both those scenarios, one relatively recently in 2020, they were unwilling to use that power to pass legislation that could actually meet the scale of the problems being faced by the working class in this country, to resolve these issues, to not leave them out there to be exploited by Trump and others who are saying about their grievances. Instead of being worried about big businesses, you should be worried about immigrants, even though it's the big businesses that are responsible for the inflation that's destroying your basic livelihood. To misdirect people's anger at the fact that the government seems to be working totally inefficiently because the Democrats failed to fund critical services, so they can't actually operate in a way that makes sense. That our cities are falling down because they failed to actually advocate for them, even though they represent most of them. I mean, they've had the power. They failed to use the power. I mean, you can even see how Trump and the Republicans are using the power. They failed to even do that. I mean, the Senate makes its own rules. They can more or less do whatever they want to do. But when Democrats have control of the Senate, they say, well, we got to go with the parliamentarian and all these other things, and they don't do anything. The Republicans just do whatever they want to do. So part of why we are here in the first place is because the Trump movement has been tremendously empowered by the inability of the Democratic Party to actually push policies that a significant amount of the country actually support, like having health care for all people, like addressing the economy in a way that holds the biggest businesses and the richest people accountable from taxes and other different things like that. They've just failed to do it. They've allowed others to exploit it. Now we're in a place where the right wing is in pole position in the entire political system, and they are using that position aggressively to try to bulldoze any opposition and push things through, and the Democrats have no idea how to fight back. And even when their own supporters are crying for them to take on a more aggressive form of pushback to start to address these issues more effectively, I mean, you can see huge majorities of people in the Democrats now, saying that they want some form of socialism, that the Democrats need to push against capitalism, that they need to address these utilities and these banks and these billionaires and really bring them to task for the social crimes that they're committing on society, where people are dying from preventable diseases because they don't have health care, where they're dying because of poverty, where they're dying because of homelessness, to just end this dictatorship of these ultra rich people who would rather have, totally treatable, fixable problems move forward, even though it would cost them nothing, just because they'd rather have the heated Olympic-size pool in their giant mansion, or their third giant mansion, as opposed to the regular Olympic-size pool. Like, that's the level of greed that we see from people, and the Democrats won't stop it. And we see that the voters are sort of taking it into their own hands. And that's why we can see people like Zohran Mamdani, who may become the mayor of New York. And of course, he calls himself a democratic socialist. He's saying he's going to address issues of affordability, from rent to transportation to food, all these critically important things that all people want to see addressed. Certainly Democrats want to see addressed more aggressively. But then you look at how someone like Hakeem Jeffries responds to someone like Mamdani, who he's actually refused to endorse.
Leader, where do you land on this mayoral race in New York, and in particular on Mamdani? who is clearly now the front runner in this situation, won the primary. You have not publicly come out endorsed him yet. And I'm curious what you're thinking.
Well, he ran a strong race in the primary, obviously, relentlessly focused on affordability, which is a big problem, of course, here in New York City, along with every other part of the United States of America. And he outworked the opposition. He outmessaged the opposition and outorganized the opposition. But now during the general election, of course, he's going to have to demonstrate to a broader electorate, including in many of the neighborhoods that I represent in Brooklyn, that his ideas can actually be put into reality. And that's, you know, the conversation that he's having with me and having with people who are community leaders and residents in the 8th Congressional District I serve.
And that sounds like you're not convinced then yet.
No, well, we had one initial conversation. It was a constructive and candid conversation. It was centered around the community. And in that conversation, he indicated he'd like my help in putting together additional meetings with members of the congressional delegation, as well as leaders in many of the communities that I represent in neighborhoods like East New York and Brownsville, Canarsie, some of the more lower income working class neighborhoods that I may serve. I agreed to do that. That meeting is being put into motion right now.
Well, you can see there, you know, a dog whistle from Hakeem Jeffries saying that, you know, in central Brooklyn, where he represents, that there are now more questions for Mamdani to answer, because people there must be wondering about him or whether or not his platform is something that they would want to embrace. And he's implying, of course, that black people would not support someone who labels themselves a democratic socialist. And he's implying that in the primary of New York City, that was in fact the impact of the vote, that people did not vote for Mamdani in the district he represents. Well, President Obama's former Svengali, David Axelrod, was asked about this and other things and noted this point.
By the way, he carried Hakeem Jeffries' district 2-1.
Well, can we actually play that again?
By the way, he carried Hakeem Jeffries' district 2-1.
Well, carried Hakeem Jeffries' district 2-1. So you can see here, obviously the Democrats, you know, they're sending letters. They're talking about they're going to pass bills. They're lying about, even in their own districts, what the policies of the people who vote for them actually support and want to see them fight for. So I think you could pretty much conclude from that, and let's see what happens with the shutdown. Let's hope that somehow the Republicans are the ones who fold and that we find a way to keep 15 million people from getting kicked off of healthcare. But you can see, I think, pretty clearly why the Republican leadership has decided to roll the dice and think that they can bulldoze the Democratic administration. So we'll have to see what happens with this shutdown. Hopefully it goes a different way. I don't want to be too cynical about it, but I think I have to note here as we start to close that the only thing I think average, everyday working class people who are struggling to make it can conclude from this is that you cannot rely on either the Democrats or the Republicans to solve the problems that are making it more difficult for you to live and to meet your ends meet day to day. The only way that you're going to find any salvation is amongst yourselves and your fellow coworkers, friends, neighbors, loved ones coming together and bringing together a collective movement that can actually push for the salvation of working class people and to overturn this unbelievable dictatorship of billionaires and bankers and corporate heads that obviously just want to destroy everyone else's lives for their own profits.